All right, good evening. I take no credit for fixing that. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of conferences, campus lectures, discussions, and conversations that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. We also sponsor initiatives on Jewish-Christian understanding and to enhance our understanding of Catholicism from a global perspective. So I'm grateful to you for all being here tonight and for me to have the chance to welcome Dr. Jim O'Connell, who is the president and founder of Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. It's a special event that we're co-sponsored with the Health Studies Advising Program, and I thank my colleagues who are here from that program, Miles and others. Dr. O'Connell is here to help us think about a widespread and daunting problem, homelessness. Here in Worcester County, the homeless population rose for the third year in a row from 2023 to 2024, growing nearly 20%. Boston has the second highest homeless rate in the U.S., but also provides significantly more shelter options than other cities. The work it would take to minimize homeless and to care for the homeless well, physically, mentally, and in other ways, is difficult and complicated. Yet programs like Boston Healthcare for the Homeless play a large part in Massachusetts' approach. Since Dr. O'Connell founded it in 1985, Boston Healthcare for the Homeless has become the country's largest and most comprehensive program of its kind, serving nearly 10,000 homeless people a year in 2 hospital-based clinics and more than 60 shelters and outreach sites. Throughout his 30 years at the helm, Dr. O'Connell has continued to serve on the team of doctors that meets patients on the streets, offering food and warm socks, medical treatment, and the support of trusted friends. His journey to this point hasn't been straightforward, as he's talked about in many places. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Notre Dame, so that's one not straightforward left turn that he took. And he received a master's degree in theology from Cambridge University in 1972. After graduating from Harvard Medical School in 1982, he completed a residency in internal medicine at Mass General Hospital. He was awarded an oncology fellowship at Memorial Sloan Kettering, but deferred it to become the founding physician and first president of Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, a position he's held ever since. He's been featured on ABC's Nightline, CBS Evening News, several feature-length documentaries. He's received many honorary degrees and awards, including the Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Award in 2012, the Trustees Medal at the Bicentennial Celebration of Mass General Hospital in 2011. He's collaborated with homeless programs in many cities in the USA and across the globe, including Los Angeles, London, and Sydney. His book, Stories from the Shadows, Reflections of a Street Doctor, was published in 2015. And in 2023, his work was chronicled by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Tracy Kidder in the book Rough Sleepers, Dr. Jim O'Connell's Urgent Mission to Bring Urgent Healing to Homeless People. Dr. O'Connell is also an assistant professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. But this is not his first time on campus. Some of you may recognize him and know that he was that he was the speaker at Holy Cross's 2017 commencement, where he received an honorary degree in public service. And I'd note that he's joined today by 2 Holy Cross alumnae who also work for Boston Healthcare for the Homeless, Julie Bogdansky, 06, and Sarah Pacell, a class of 82. So please join me in welcoming them and Dr. Jim O'Connell.
Thank you very much. Oh, wow, that's on. Excuse me. Thank you very much, and thank you for waiting patiently. I can't believe you would all be here on a school night, and I'm entirely honored. I have to learn how to do this. If I just go like that, does it work?
Oh, you press the V. Oh, you pull the keyboard out. There you go.
Oh, is there a keyboard here? Oh, yeah, great. Oh, thank you. So what first of all, we spent a lot of time at dinner talking about how tough it is to be a pre-med and what you have to do to get into medical school. And I often thought that the process you're going through now is this process designed, if you're a pre-med here, it's a process designed precisely to weed out the people who would be the best doctors. So don't give up on this process. We've never learned how to do it well. And I trust that you're here under Miles's leadership and you've got lots of support. And I would urge you to please stick with it and try to enjoy life as you're going through all those crazy things we make you go through. But tonight I want to share with you just some of the, as you probably caught from that very kind introduction, thank you. I often tell everybody that there's a missing decade there about which nothing was said, and my mother would not let me talk about it unless we would like go to a pub and have a scotch or something like that. So there were years when I was wandering around trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and just be ready. There's a lot of accidents and, sort of left turns and right turns happen along your path. No matter what you think you're going to do, just be ready to be open to changes like that. For me, it happened when I started medical school when I was 30, and it was, all I wanted to do was get to work. I wanted to finish residency and get to work. And I took this year to go try to help start this new program in Boston, which was designed to reach out to take care of homeless people. But it was a delay in what my real career was, which I wanted to be an oncologist. So the story I'm telling you today was just an accidental tourist story, okay? But hear that, it's now 40 years. Anyway, what I didn't know, when I finished, my last job at Mass General as a senior resident was to be in charge of the medical intensive care unit. And for those of you who might be looking ahead, after your 4 years of medical school and 3 years of residency, when you run the ICU as a medical resident, you feel you've arrived, and as I like to put it, your ego can barely fit into rooms this size. And so I figured, heck, I'm going to do a year now going down to the shelters and do clinics in the shelters. How tough can that be? Especially after people coming from all over, and I could figure out how to at least manage them if I didn't understand what was going on. But what I didn't know was that Boston had gotten a grant. And the condition of this grant was the mayor, and the grants were given to the mayor. It was a 4-year grant, but the mayor had to call homeless people together to say, how do you want to be served? And I'm a resident, so I know nothing about this. And this is a later picture of people who have lived and experienced homelessness, who were willing to gather around and say what they really wanted. And it was striking, because I was so used to, I knew what I wanted to do. I had all these people ready to do it. But what I found out when we got here, let me see if I go, I'll figure this out in a minute, hold on. No, I won't.
Just the arrows?
Is it just arrows? Let's see, okay. What do you think?
Arrows here should work.
That didn't work, yeah, the arrows didn't go.
Oh.
So sorry, you'd think I'd know how to do this stuff
You
now,
think
but I
I'd
do
know
not.
too.
Yeah, it's not, maybe, can I do this?
No, it's supposed to work on here.
No? Oh, there, I can do it from here. Okay, on the screen. So here's what they came up with. This is what homeless people wanted, okay? Not exactly what we wanted, but they were so sick of lives being full of fragmentation and loss. What they were looking for was continuity and consistency. So they were looking for a program that would people would reach out and go to the shelter in the streets, but be fully integrated into the hospitals as well. So when they were sick and had to go to the hospital, their own doctors and nurses took care of them. But those doctors and nurses would go out and see them wherever they were. Because it's really hard, as you can imagine, if you're struggling to survive on the streets. Making an appointment 2 Tuesdays from now at 3 o'clock at some hospital is just never going to happen. So we needed to go to them. The second thing they wanted to do was have us work in teams. And I look back on that now, and I remember thinking that, I had sort of trained in a hospital where you sort of were independent. You worked as efficiently as you could, but you collaborated with everybody, but you took care of your patients. And this was a group of people saying, no, we don't want one person, we want a team. So I've never had a panel of my own patients when I've been in this job, but I've always worked with nurse practitioners, a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant, psychiatrist, and our team has expanded, and we all share equally in the care of each person. So should I go, which was their great fear, like their look was somebody's going to come here, and they hated this, by the way. Somebody would come here, spend 3 months, 6 months, or a year, get to know us, we'd open up to them, and then you go somewhere else and do your career. They didn't want that. They wanted some sort of consistency. So to hedge their bet, they wanted every homeless person to know a whole team. This is kind of radical. This is 1984. Later on, we've heard about patient-centered medical homes and things like that, and this is what they were thinking of. The last thing they asked for, though, was to come up with respite care, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And so I thought tonight, maybe I can't do this. So how does this go? Try it again. What did you do? What did you do?
Switch, I don't know.
Thank you.
What did that?
You may have to stay here,
Slow
Tom.
down. Has to think about it.
Okay. So I thought what I'd do is spend the next, sort of 30 minutes or 40 minutes telling you the story of our program through the eyes of somebody that we got to know really well and who sort of helped us get through the first 35 or 40 years. And his name is Michael. And I met him when he was on the streets in 1986. Or maybe late 1985, and he was just a character. He had been on the streets forever. He knew everybody. He scrambled around all night long. And the way I got to know him was on this van. Let's see how quickly these things can change. Oh my God. Maybe it's a double click, huh? Anyway, what we found was that we were doing these clinics in all the shelters, and we got our staff out there, and we did nightly clinics in many shelters. But there was a group of people who didn't come into the shelter and stayed outside. And the first winter we worked, we realized those are the people who were at greatest risk of dying. So how do we get to them was the question. And the Department of Public Health, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, gave money to Pine Street Inn to have a van go out at nighttime, at 9 at night till 5 in the morning. And we had these big meetings, and I tried to make it a medical van, but the homeless people out on the streets were not interested in seeing a doctor or nurse at 2 in the morning. They wanted blankets and soup and sandwiches and stuff that was practical to keep them alive. So this van started as an outreach van, and I would, as long as I bought the coffee, I used to be able to ride it on Mondays and Wednesdays. And there was a group of people that I'm going to show you here. It isn't a double. There. Who are the ones that run the van. These are the heroes of the story, okay? They are out, basically, this is an old picture now, it's evolved, but they're out every night, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, reaching out to homeless people around Boston. And the van goes all around all night, and they get to know just about everybody outside. And so I was piggybacking on the trust they had built every night. And so I could go on Mondays and Wednesdays, say, serve the soup and sandwiches, but say, if you need anything, I'm a doctor, I can help. And it was the best experience I'd ever had. And I'm so sorry, there's a delay here, and I gotta learn how to do this. And just to give you a couple examples, you know all this, it's what was my introduction to it, but is what was going on outside I couldn't believe. So this is an elderly man, it's the temperature's about minus 10 degrees, it's a northeaster, snowing, and the van is out there bringing him, this is on the steps of Trinity Church, which is at Copley Square in Boston. And this is one of the van folks just going to make sure he's okay and getting him some soup and stuff. But this man would not come in. I mean, he would stay outside. That's how there's a group of people that for whatever complicated reasons, they can't go into a big shelter or go into a shelter. And we could talk about that all night about what those reasons are. And in Boston, by the way, as Tom said, we have 95% of everybody who's homeless tonight in Boston will be in a shelter, and less than 5% will be outside. So it's shifted. If you go to the West Coast cities, you'll see that shifted, where 95% will be outside, and the others will be in the very few shelters. I just threw this slide in because I had to get used to all sorts of people being outside who you wouldn't predict. And this is a 92-year-old woman who stayed outside all winter. She's sleeping there at what's on the front part of Old City Hall, where we could give her soup and sandwiches, but we could not get her to come in. And here, I don't know if you notice, it's hard to see in this picture, but her legs now, I'm really worried, her legs are swollen and they look like they're getting infected. And so we struggle all the time, as many of you will deal with if you get into this, of how much do you allow people to do whatever they want versus if you're really worried they might die or something's going to happen, do you bring them in against their will? And that struggle between preserving or taking away personal liberties has never, ever been easy. And I don't have any good solutions to it, except the longer you know someone, the more likely you can tell when it's time to come in. She eventually did come in, by the way, but it was only after the winter was done. And this is a picture, Sarah, of Keisha, who's one of our that group of people I showed you at the beginning eventually became what they call our Consumer Advisory Board. And from them, there's about anywhere from 3 to 7 of them will be made part of our board of directors. So it was an effort to make sure that the people we're serving stayed very much a part of the design and the implementation and the governance of the program. So as Keisha would like to point out, and her friends, that they hire and fire us. They're our board of directors, so we have to pay attention to them, and it's the best thing that ever happened to us. But Keisha took this picture in the year late in the fall of 1999, just before the turn of the century. And for those of you around then, it was Y2K time. I remember we were worried about whether our computers would all crash with the turn of the century. But she took this picture of her street friend. She lived under the Longfellow Bridge, which is a bridge that goes over the Charles River, not far from Mass General. And she lived up into the rafters with her boyfriend for years. And she took this picture. These were all her friends. There is one woman there who's hiding behind the guy in the striped shirt. And I didn't see the picture until about 5 years later. She needed to go in for some serious surgery, and she asked me to hold on to her stuff. And if any of you have cared for homeless people, one of the problems is they carry everything they own with them. And so when we say, oh, come on into the hospital, they either have to bring everything they've got, or they've got to find some place to hide it and save it. And it is a real barrier to getting people to come into care. So we do everything we can to make sure, certainly back then, that we would take care of their stuff while they went in. So she gave me her stuff, and there was a picture, and I looked at it then, and I realized we knew all these men. We knew them really well, could tell you all their stories, because they were all kind of the characters who lived on the streets. And I was blown away because, one, this was the year 2000 or 1999 when that was taken, and every homeless person in Massachusetts at that time was eligible for Medicaid. They had Medicaid, so they're fully insured. It's not an uninsured population. The second thing is their average age is somewhere around 36 years old. And the third thing that completely blew my mind is that they're sitting in a park on the grounds of our hospital, Mass General Hospital. So this is literally on the grounds of Mass General Hospital. And when I looked at that picture 5 years after it was taken, there were 2 of those people still alive, just 2 of them. And one died soon after that. And it just gave us just a glimpse of how dangerous it is to be living on the streets in the shadows, by the way, of some of our best healthcare institutions, which we were talking about at dinner as well. I'm so sorry, maybe that go. So we did do, Jill Roncaretti, who was our physician assistant on our team, along with several other folks, did a study of looking at, we know that people living in the shelters of Boston die at 4 times the rate of somebody the same age. But if you live on the streets, you die now at about 12 times the rate of somebody that same age. So living on the streets conveys a huge premortality risk, which looks much like the worst third world country. And even though these are people, literally, those men were about 100 yards from the emergency room at Mass General Hospital. So we now know that we sort of double our efforts to try to figure out how do you care for that population. And I'm so sorry about the delay. I want to start talking and I don't have the picture there. But this is an example. These are they were not in that picture, but it's just three friends, people that had become really well known to us. And I show this because the leading cause of death among that group of people is cancer. It's not what you would think like frostbite or homicide or assault. It's cancer. A lot of this, by the way, was was done all before the drug overdose and heroin epidemic happened. But the man on the left, whose name is Jose, was from the Azores, and he, just a delightful guy. He got head and neck cancer from smoking since the time he was 8, died of head and neck cancer. The man on the right was a gypsy, a native gypsy who was born somewhere in a covered wagon. We could never get him his identification card because he didn't know where he had been born, so we couldn't figure out where to go, which, believe it or not, if you don't have an ID, it gets really hard to live in our country. Anyway, he died of terrible lung disease. He had COPD. And the man in the middle, who we all love dearly, was in an argument with a close friend at a Boston Celtics game or at a concert down at the Garden and was stabbed in the chest and died. So, that's the kind of what we have to come to grips with. People are at great risk, and it's really, it's paralyzing as you get to know them so well. Now, I just thought I'd show you this. This is the last of the men in that picture to die, and he died about 3 years ago now of pancreatic cancer. And he managed to get into housing after years and years in the street. He was very proudly a Native American. He was from the Micmac tribe in northern Maine, just southern Canada. But he had lost all contact with his tribe and his friends and his families. And he died of, and he was just delightful, as you can imagine. He died of pancreatic cancer at Mass General. And when he died, we often think about how do you how do you remember people who died? How do you mark the passing somehow? Which is exquisitely important to their friends, the other people who are homeless, because they've been left out of so much. They've been excluded from most of the American dreams that we're all part of. So when they die, it becomes a really profound event for the people that they've known, that little community on the streets. So we do all sorts of things to try to find that. But one great resource has been, there's a shrine, a Franciscan shrine in downtown Boston on Arch Street called St. Anthony Shrine. And they have a Lazarus program, and the friars there will, for a few people, will say a mass, and then they have a burial ground where they can go. And so Mark was qualified for that, and he had just sort of, we had a little ceremony with it. There were a handful of people at the chapel at St. Anthony's, and if this picture ever turns, you'll see it. Wow. So this was his memorial service. It actually was a mass and his memorial service. And if you look carefully, the person playing the cello is Yo-Yo Ma. And one thing that kind of is stunning, which you will all know, is that people really come out and help in ways you would never know. And Yo-Yo Ma goes to unattended funerals and plays with no fanfare. He would shoot us if we showed that picture, so you didn't see this, okay? But that's what he does. It's really quite, and I kept thinking if Mark, who had died, only knew that Yo-Yo Ma would be at his funeral to play, it would have given him some real sense of accomplishment. But, I'm so sorry, this is slow. What we realized after all this, and remember now Michael is the person, he's now living out on the streets, he's just typical of the people we know. And we started realizing the van was great, but we really had to go out during the daytime. So nighttime, you can see a lot of people, but there's no services open, so you have to finagle things. So we started a team that goes out during the daytime, and it goes on the streets most days of the week. In the beginning, we used to go, this was Finagle a Bagel down at the Park Street station. We would start our rounds there, and homeless people would know we would be there, and it would be kind of fun to do that. But
your clicker isn't working, so Cindy was doing that. So if you just
Cindy was doing that.
So it looks like you're trying.
So she's, Cindy, thank you. Would you go to the next one, please? I'll go relatively quickly, thank you. So this didn't work. Okay.
You think you're powerful.
I think, yeah, I know what I'm doing. No, I don't. But one of the things that has been fabulous about this is that, and I've often said that if you try to take care of homeless people living on the streets and the shelters, you learn the weaknesses in our healthcare system really quickly. And one of the biggest weaknesses is that we work so separate from one another. And for example, if I was seeing somebody with a pneumonia who really needed a psychiatrist to help with their thought disorder, I'd have to refer them to a whole nother system, a whole nother thing, and that never worked. So what we learned is we would just bring all of us together and just go out and share in the care. So the reason I love this slide is the woman in red is Eileen Riley, who's our psychiatrist on the street. She's been doing this for about 25 years, and she's magic. So we can be all together, and the man in the red is a therapist, and you can go out, we're just there together, and you can just have an integrated kind of fun way to approach things. And the next slide, Cindy, thank you, is another example of our team. This is a more recent picture, so you can see this is our nurse Becky with our newest psychiatrist, who's Katie Koenigser, and a man who lived in that alley behind there who was a character, and then Katie, who is our nurse practitioner, who's now going over to the dock side. She crossed the Charles River and works on the Cambridge Healthcare for the Homeless now. But it's just an example of how you can actually have a lot more fun than you would have thought. The streets are not dull, they can be really fun. And then the next slide, Cindy, this is Jim Bonner, who was our full-time psychiatrist for 10 years. Actually, the truth be known, his salary is paid fully by the hospital. So one theme I have here that I may not get to is that how do we get hospitals and health centers and health plans to get involved in the care of these very marginalized folks? And Mass General, as a part of the determination of need, gave us the money to have a full-time psychiatrist whose job was to take care of people on the street, that he didn't have another place he had to be. And it was magic for him. He was a seasoned psychiatrist. He had run community mental health centers. He was a Harvard graduate. And he came out when he was in his mid to late 60s and just found a new renaissance of life out on the streets. And all the people that he used to say were resistant to care, they would never come in, he found that if he would get to know them slowly over time, sit at a McDonald's and talk to them, they were perfectly willing to be cared for. So this is just a picture that I've loved, because that was a patient he'd followed for years and years, he did all of his therapy, all of his prescribing, and all of his talking basically at that was a Burger King, I shouldn't say McDonald's. And on the next slide, Cindy, we get challenged particularly by the nurses. I don't know how many of you are going to be nurses here, but most of what I'm telling you is what nurses have taught me. What our nurses said and our physician assistant was, what's so sacred about being in a clinic? What goes on there that couldn't go on somewhere else, much more convenient to a homeless person. And when we thought about it, and I was embarrassed, about 80% of everything we do when we're seeing people in our clinics could be done at a park bench or or sitting on the grass in the middle of a common. And this is Dave Munson, who's now the doctor kind of running our team. He's fabulous. And this is an 82-year-old woman who has terrible heart failure, but won't go to the hospital until she's so sick that she has to be brought in by an ambulance. But this is South Station in Boston, which many of you may know, but she was perfectly willing to let us do all of her care right there. And I learned a lot with this. So this is Dave, and you could weigh her, which is very important with heart failure. You could change her medications. It was a CVS right there, so we could change medicine anytime. We could draw her bloods, listen to her lungs, and pretty much take care of her, and which we did for years without her having to go to the hospital but a handful of times. And it was just shocking for us to realize, oh my God, we've been thinking so narrowly, we have to start thinking much more expansively. And I could go on and on about how many chronic illnesses we can manage very well on the streets as long as you've got an integrated care system. And the next slide is an example of sort of more of the public health aspect of it. So we found in the beginning, no one would say yes if we said you want a flu shot. They would all refuse. None of the women on the streets had had a pap smear or a mammogram in years or in their memory. And over time, as we got to know people, we realized, isn't that interesting, that as you earn their trust and you can say, can I give you a shot, or can I take you into particularly our women providers, do your pap smear or something like that, it turns out that the things change completely. So during flu season, most people on the street, certainly in the very beginning, would accept a flu shot in a second. And this is our physician assistant giving a flu shot to someone at the public library sitting outside. And so we just pick a time and then just go out and try to do as many flu shots as possible. And the secret is the person that's giving it to them has to be someone they know. We can't say, go to the flu clinic over here. They just will never do that. So we learned a lot. And on the next slide, this sort of slide gives me kind of a good feeling, because I was not really a part of this. I had to back off during COVID a lot. But this is when the vaccines came out for COVID. You remember how difficult it was for people to say yes to a vaccine? It was very skeptical. But because COVID, we had to turn ourselves upside down. About 40% of everybody who was homeless living in shelters in Boston got COVID. It was horrifying. And the management of that became even more horrifying, because you had to isolate people. Where do you put them if there's 800 people in a shelter? How do you isolate people? So when the vaccines came out, it was like a miracle. So I don't know if any of you are thinking of going on to biotech or anything like that, but I've stopped being critical of biotech because the number of lives that have been saved by the science that goes into this, it's breathtaking science. But anyway, this was when we finally got our vaccines. And this is that same park where the picture was taken, the Mousy Park. And that's Jen, our physician assistant, giving a vaccine to this man. And there were almost no one on the streets who said no to a shot, as long as it was given to them by someone they knew. So this investment in what I like to think of now as continuity of longevity of care, I think results in much higher quality of care. But we could talk about that another. Now, next slide goes back to Michael. This is Michael several years later. And he's looking obviously a little older. And his story was that he had grown up in South Carolina, and he had lived in a really tough family. And eventually the state removed him from his family and sent him up to live in Boston with an uncle. And that didn't work out either. And so when he was 14, he ended up on the streets of Boston, kind of a truant running away. Never learned to read or write. think he had a severe reading disorder, but he had incredible street skills. You know, he could charm you into giving him whatever money you had in your pocket. And I was always amazed by that. But he also had many medical problems, and we would try to care for him on the streets as much as we could. But when people end up needing imaging and some more intense thing, that's when you realize that good quality care really necessitates that you have the backup or the accessibility to a hospital and things. So on the next slide, one of the things we do have in our programs, we have a clinic every day at Boston Medical Center as our hospital base there. It actually occurs in our current building, which is just across the street from the emergency room. And then we have a regular clinic every day, Monday through Friday at Mass General. And all of our docs have to be credentialed in one or both of those hospitals so that we can have full access to the hospital. Anyway, we have a clinic there, and in the next slide, it's just kind of a fun clinic where people we've seen on the street for a long time can lure them in and say, "We'll see you, we will see you, come and see us." So we used to think it was because it was Mass General, and nobody cared that it was Mass General. They only cared that they were going to see you, who I knew from the street. And this is that same man I showed you in the middle of the picture of the man who had died, who brought these flowers for Valentine's Day for our nurses and caseworker. And the atmosphere at the clinic is actually really kind of fun. And I think I'm gonna skip over the next slide, if you go the 2 slides over. So Michael so we have that clinic going on, that's where we would do any of his intensive care. And, I'm sorry, back one, sorry. So this is him now, frame shift now. So the first picture was 85, that last picture was probably around 2001. And this is Michael in 2015. So he's now obviously gotten older, but he's out sitting on the steps of Starbucks, which is right on the corner of Charles Street and Beacon Street. And he knew everybody going in and out. He'd been there for years. He knew your name, the kid's name. You know, he just was brilliant about that, and people loved him. But he's looking ill now. We didn't know what was going on, so we brought him over to the clinic, and he had nodes above his clavicles, which is never a good sign. And it turned out he had prostate cancer that was metastatic to lots of places had spread to lots of places in his body. So we brought him over to our respite program. Remember in the beginning I showed you the homeless people insist on a respite program. On the next slide, just because I can embarrass Julie with this, this is Michael, who we got him over. I'm telling him this terrible diagnosis. We're going to have to start chemotherapy, radiation. We had him fully hooked into the Mass General thing, but he had no place to be, so we brought him to our respite program, where instead of being grim and, like tense the way I was, he sits up and he's thrilled. Okay, he's got a bed. He has a bed. He has 3 meals a day. He has Julie, and this is Kate, our nurse, taking care of him. And he, would smile and say, "God, this doesn't get any better. This is great." And you realize the perspective that he had and his ability to get joy out of what all of us would have been just devastated by came from the circumstance that he had lived in. And I can show you in the next picture, this was the earliest slide I have of our respite program. Sorry, Cindy, if you can go to the next one, great. And this is an old slide of where we started in September of 1985 with 20 beds inside the Lemuel Shattuck shelter. And it was during the days, for those who might have been around, I know many of you were not, but when AIDS had devastated the homeless population, we had a huge outbreak of multi-drug tuberculosis. And that little unit soon became an AIDS and TB unit. And we were just awash in really serious illness. But over the years, we were able to go to the next slide. We were able to expand that unit to, it's now essentially 123 beds in 2 different places, but 103 in this, which is our main building right across from Boston City Hospital. It's actually used to be called the Mallory Institute of Pathology. If any of you going on to medical school, you're going to learn about Mallory Weiss bodies and Mallory tears. They were all worked out in that building, which was the site of BU, Harvard, and Tufts had their pathology departments in that building, and it was also the city morgue. So it has a really kind of delicate history that we have to walk around very delicately. And in the next slide, what we can do there is all sorts of interesting stuff. Like this is Ernesto Gonzalez, who was the chief of ambulatory dermatology at Mass General, and he and the derm residents will come and do clinics there regularly. We can have lots of specialty care come to people rather than them go to the specialist. And then we can do all sorts of, kind of sweet care. Anyway, frame shifted. So Michael goes through this really pretty intense regimen of chemotherapy. He didn't need any surgery, and he needed radiation. And he stayed at McGinnis House, our respite program, for most of that. And he went into remission, which was huge. And when he went into remission, we didn't want to let him go back to the street, so we moved him over to our step-down respite program. And this is him over there when we discovered, the next slide, I'm sorry, Cindy. In the next slide, you can see that he's still happy, he's still smiling, he's particularly happy that his cancer's in remission, but mostly he's happy because we have therapy dogs that will stop by, and he is an animal fanatic, which I had never realized, and he just went crazy on the days he was there. But while he was there, I'm gonna go, Cindy, if you could go 2 slides, okay. While he was there, we were able to, our caseworkers and stuff, were able to hook him up to get housing. And remember, he's now 62 years old. The first pictures, he was in his early 30s. So he's now 62, has never had his own place. So this is him signing the lease for his first ever apartment. And you can see there's still a huge broad smile. And so once he signed that, we brought him, it turned out to be a place not very far from where our step-down unit is. And as we took him over there, he insisted on going over to the animal shelter, because he didn't want to go into an apartment without an animal. And in the next slide, Cindy, this is his cat. He got his cat, and he's like ecstatic, okay? And I'm looking at this guy and just saying, he can teach us so much about how to live our lives, I'm telling you. But now it brings up, so he goes into his own apartment, and he's still, he has not many skills. He's really good when people are around, but you put him alone in his apartment, it's really tricky. And it was hard for him to figure out who he was, who could he charm, who could he do. And the cat became really his thing. And we learned, and on the next slide, this is a woman named Ellen Daly, who was a co-chair of our board of directors. She was a woman who had been homeless for many years. And she was fierce, and when a lot of the people we were caring for started to get housing, and this is in 2004, and people on the streets never qualified for housing until we had these things called Housing First, which we could talk about. But all of a sudden they were going into housing, and we're a street team, shelter team. The question was, do we continue to follow them or not? And our consumer board, and Ellen, the most vocal of that, said, look, if we've been following them for 20 years, you can't abandon them just because they go into housing. So we had to learn, we had to do this shift from being a street team to being a street team that does about half our time visiting formerly homeless street folks in our homes. I should have said, by the way, there's a whole nomenclature thing here. So the other thing we've learned from the consumers on our board is that what's the right word to use? When you talk about, is it a homeless person? Is it a person experiencing homelessness? Is it unhoused, or is it a you can go on. And it turns out they're really interesting. There's not a unified voice, but most of them, the term most of us want to use now when we're writing papers is a person experiencing homelessness. And they hate that. They hate it because they think it's us academics trying to describe something and make it sound nicer than what it really is. They just want to go say, damn it, I'm homeless. Just don't use it as a noun. And then when we would try to say unhoused, they say, it's not a house I'm worried about a home. So they like us to use homeless. It's really weird. So when I say that now, I know I'm acting like I'm 40 years out of date, but that really comes from being beaten up by these folks. The other thing they hate is behavioral health. We used to say medical and mental health and substance use disorder, and then we combined mental health and substance use disorder into what we call behavioral health. And they went nuts because it sounds like to them we're impugning their behavior. And it's not about that. They say, it's my thoughts, it's not my behavior, or it's my emotions or something, but not my behavior. So we had to go back and say, medical, psychiatric, and substance use care. And we get criticized for that all the time, but we're just obeying our bosses here. So Ellen made us make sure we get involved in housing, and I wanted to show you two offshoots here. One, in the next slide, Cindy, is a man who lived on the streets for about 30 years. He always wore a three-piece suit with this tie, has a camel hair coat and a fedora, and he calls himself a judge. He acts, talks, and responds like a judge. And this is Jill, who's our physician assistant at the time, with him on Boston Common, where he spent most of his days. He would go to the State House and sit in the library and do his, whatever his judicial work was. But he also suffered from really terrible alcoholism, would drink like crazy. And we would have to pick him up on the van. It was really sad. He'd be on the ground, his tie askew, and I can remember going up to him saying, "Hey, Judge, can we just take you in now?" And he'd sort of look up, completely, not sure where he was, and then go right into his role. "Oh, good evening, Dr. O'Connell," and he'd start this whole judicial conversation. And then he got into housing in the next slide. So after all those years, he got into housing. And I wanted to show you this because he said he was a graduate of where that sweatshirt is, very proudly. And then he had gone to Harvard Law School and then was a judge. And in his new place, which was in a Catholic Charities building, actually, he had, you can see a globe, which was what you should have if you're a judge there, his sweatshirts from Holy Cross, still wearing his three-piece suit, beautiful bed with a, kind of a nice blanket on there. And then in the next slide, you can see the desk in the middle of the room that he called his chambers, right? And on the desk are all these legal papers, okay, things that, he was fascinated, if not obsessed, with Roe v. Wade. And then the other thing was, on the big blue book here is what was the latest encyclical from, I think it was Pope Paul II at the time, and he fancied himself a canonical lawyer, and he would just talk law. And I'll never forget, let me go, the next slide, I'll tell you more about this, but this was his shoes. He got wooden shoe trees in his shoes. This man has been on the streets for 30 years, right? And then the last slide of him I have is the next one, and this was a portrait he asked me to take, and this was a mistake. It was a throwaway camera, so the lighting here was bad, but I kind of think it came out like what he wanted. And it's him in his suit next to his globe, with sort of Kelly coming, like it's a Caravaggio or something. And he was very proud of that picture. But at the time, he's got a trach underneath his tie because he's now dying of head and neck cancer, which is kind of what happens every once in a while. You get people all settled in, and then the medical issues come thriving out. So the bottom line to this is we visited him all the time. I should have gone back. Can you go back? That's too many slides. One more. So I should have pointed this out, I forgot. But once he got into his housing, he turned the heat up to about 100 degrees because he didn't want to be cold anymore. And I can remember we would all just be dying when we've been trying to talk to him in there. And this picture I love because if you notice, the two candles that are supposed to be up have also withered, okay? So that's because of the heat that's in there. Thank you, and Cindy, if you can go back to there. So he ended up, we tried to take care of him at home. He didn't want to go to the hospital, wanted to have all his care done at home. And we took care of him as much as we could until about a week before he died because there was so many complicated medical things going. And I was with him in the hospice when he died. And the big issue was we didn't know who he was. We just knew he said he was a judge. It was very unlikely he really was a judge, but we didn't know. And up until the moment he died, he never went out of character, was a judge. And I remember I have a friend who is a federal judge who actually invited him to come over one time, but this judge said, no, I better not do that. And if you remember in Don Quixote, the book Don Quixote, which is a fabulous book if you haven't read it, he goes around, he's a little bit deluded, but he's a peasant going around tilting windmills, doing good for everybody, and really making a difference until his friends near the end of the book disavow him of him being a knight errant. And they say, look, you're just a poor peasant. Will you stop pretending you're something else? And if you finish the book, he dies really depressed as an old man with feeling his life has been a waste. And so when we debated with our psychiatrist about, do you try to challenge him about the fact you're not a judge? Let's talk about who you are. The thought was, you don't want to, whatever had happened in his life, whatever trauma had caused him to grab that persona, it's what allowed him to do good around, and allowed him to function. And we didn't ever disavow him of that. And we still talk about whether we should have or not. Next slide is back to Michael. Michael's now in his housing. This is his, he's very proud. You can't see the cat here, but he's proud. He loves it. We see him a lot. He calls all the time asking for food from some restaurant, how to get him a new clicker for his TV. So our medical issues became less and less, and our social issues became more and more, as you can imagine. So if you're going to be caring for people in housing, this is one of the things you have to remember. And in the next picture, actually, I threw this in there because I thought, I don't know if you've seen this, Julie, but this is, every time we went there, he wanted to move that couch to a different angle. So we knew we were also going to have to move the couch. And this is Tracy Kidder when he was with us for all those years, and he adored Michael. Basically breaking his back trying to move this couch. But that's the stuff you have to do when you do that. Next slide is when Michael now, this is frame shifted to about a year and a half or 2 years ago. I can't remember now, 2 years ago, when his cancer comes roaring back. And now it's really probably not treatable at this point. You can do some palliative chemotherapy. So we had to get him back. This is Becky, our nurse. We would pick him up, the 5 days a week to go do his chemotherapy at MGH. And he had all his usual demands. Like you can see, he's got cancer now, but he won't go in until he finishes a couple cigarettes. And then we'd bring him inside. And the next slide, Cindy, we would have to get him breakfast, and he was just thrilled to have this breakfast with as much maple syrup on his French toast as he could possibly do. And then he goes up to chemotherapy from here. And I'll never forget going in to see him, and once again, I'm feeling terrible. This poor man, he's going through hell. But he's getting his chemotherapy, and he's got a nurse on either arm doing the infusions. He's got a flat screen TV in front of him, and they've given him some food in front of him. And he's in this gurney, and he just looks at me, and he goes, once again, hey, doc, it just doesn't get any better than this, And you realize, what a perspective. Anyway, he's now dying, and so he goes home, and he's now got prostate cancer get into your bones, and when it gets into your bones, it's incredibly painful. And Michael's, in the next slide, Cindy, this is him at home, and he can barely talk because he's in such pain. But he won't come to the hospital where we could give him a whole bunch of real effective medications because of the cat. See the cat in the front? So now we've got the added problem of he won't leave that cat. And so thankfully, our nurse practitioner, our physician assistant, Jen Nunes, the one who was giving this, in fact, said, look, Michael, I'll take that cat home if you'll just go to the hospital. So he did. He let her take it, and then he came with us to the hospital. And we got him admitted. He got put on all these end-of-life kind of comfort measures. And I went home, and that night, first night he was there, he called me and he said, which is such a typical call from him, he said, Doc, you got to bring me a Big Mac, but no lettuce. And he had a few other instructions. I don't know if you've ever tried to get a Big Mac with no lettuce. It takes a long time, okay? So I went, okay, but you sure you can eat this, Michael? And he said, oh yeah, no problem, Doc. So I got it. I brought it to him the next morning when we were doing rounds, and he looks like death warm. He's prostate on his bed. Everything's dark. It's really hospice kind of end-of-life care. And I said, Michael, you sure I'm here? You sure you want this sandwich? And in the next picture, he sits up out of nowhere, gives this huge smile because he's got his Big Mac. He can't eat it, but he can smell it and he can sort of, get the sense of it. And he just knew how to take the joy out of any moment that he could have joy. And we were like stunned because we don't act like this. This is someone who is grateful for the littlest things in life. So he taught us a huge lesson. And I'm going to sort of stop there. So that gives you a sort of a 40-year sense of, what it's like to follow people over all that time. And the next slide, and this is the last one I'll show you, is all of us getting together. So it takes a lot of people working together to do something like this. This is that same park where all those guys were sitting who died. And you can see that's a bunch of homeless people with our staff, the police from Mass General are there, the volunteers are there. And that was, we were celebrating a medical student who had just gotten into, undergraduate who just gotten into medical school. And everybody showed up. And it was kind of like, I was thinking the tragedy of homelessness is awful. And we could talk about just what you had mentioned about it's growing. The solutions are not easy. It's more complicated than we ever thought. It's worse today than when I started in 1985. But if you focus on how do you care for the people stuck in that, which is another job, you can do some pretty radically wonderful things and kind of get a little bit of joy despite the tragedy in there. And I think I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions, but there you have it. And thank you, Cindy, for doing those slides for me. Okay. But